Welcome back to the deep dive. We take the source material you share with us and, well, we plunge right in.
We pull out the most fascinating insights, those surprising facts, and maybe different perspectives that are kind of hiding in there.
Think of it as getting the critical info you need without having to, comb through pages of dense text yourself.
Exactly. We do the digging so you can just focus on the discoveries.
Absolutely. And today, we are navigating a really rich collection of source material. It gives us a deep look into Roman society, philosophy, and religion.
And during a really complex time, wouldn't you say? Very contradictory period.
Totally. We're talking roughly from the tumultuous reign of Nero through to the more settled Antonine Age.
Our mission here in this deep dive is to really get a feel for what life was actually like for different kinds of people back then.
Yeah, moving beyond just the emperors and the big battles.
Right. We want to explore the lives of the elite, sure, but also the experience of those who gained their freedom from slavery.
The rise of new spiritual ideas, the philosophical currents shaping how people thought.
What did all of that mean for someone just, you know, living their life day to day, trying to find meaning, maybe build a community?
Maybe even find some happiness in this pretty rapidly changing world.
Let's unpack this material. Let's see what it tells us.
Okay, let's start right at the top then. The world of the Roman elite.
Good place to start. And the sources, they really highlight this incredible contrast within the period itself.
How so?
You've got the Antonine Age sources talk about significant peace, prosperity, a sort of humane government.
Okay, sounds pretty good.
But then contrast that sharply with the sheer terror people experienced under emperors like, say, Nero or Domitian.
Wow, yeah, big difference.
And that dramatic shift in the political climate, it profoundly impacted the aristocracy, the old guard.
You can see that in the sources.
Oh, yeah. They show a real kind of decay setting in for the old noble families.
What was driving that?
Well, a few things. Direct pressure from the emperors themselves, for one. That could lead to poverty for some families, or just this necessary servility. You had to toe the line to survive under the really tyrannical ones.
It feels like the emperors were actively trying to undermine them sometimes. I was struck by how the sources say they lowered senatorial dignity,
How did they do that?
forcing nobles into roles that would have been just unthinkable before, making them perform as gladiators or actors even.
Right. Utterly scandalous for that class. It feels like a deliberate attempt to break their spirit, maybe their independence.
It certainly chipped away at their traditional standing.
And within this elite class, the sources show really different ways people experience the age. Take Seneca.
Okay, the famous philosopher and writer.
His writings are just drenched in this deep pessimism. Our source material describes it as born from the inner secrets of his class, surrounded by wealth, temptation everywhere.
Leading to that feeling, tedium vitae.
Weariness of life. Powerful phrase.
Yeah. And yet the sources also mention the accusations against Seneca himself. Hypocrisy.
Right. Huge wealth, lending money at interest, maybe even adultery. It's this picture of someone really struggling between high philosophical ideals and the messy realities of his world.
A real internal conflict, you think?
Perhaps. Now, contrast that gloominess with the image we get from the younger Pliny in his letters.
Ah, Pliny. Very different vibe.
Totally. He presents a much more, well, idealistic view of aristocratic life. He really emphasizes solidarity among his peers, felt this genuine duty to support promising young people.
He comes across as incredibly generous in the sources, doesn't it?
He really does. Lavish gifts, public and private, to friends, dependents. He even called his slaves humble friends.
Interesting phrasing.
He saw this generosity as just part of the job, a duty that came with his wealth and position, his descriptions of his villas, his daily routine. It paints this picture of a virtuous life, maybe a bit rigid, but virtuous.
And then there's Tacitus, the historian.
Or maybe more than just a historian. The source material emphasizes he was fundamentally a moralist.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
He looked at the age with this deep sadness. He saw cruelty from the rulers, nobles becoming, in his view, effeminate, the masses as coarse. He was always measuring the present against his ideals, old Roman character, or even the sort of rugged virtue he saw in the German tribes.
So he's judging as much as recording.
Very much so. His focus is heavily on the ethical decline, as he saw it.
It makes you wonder how much his own views shaped the history he wrote.
Definitely. And speaking of the extremes of the age, that luxury. The sources really go into detail.
Oh, yes. We're talking banquets that were legendary for how much they cost,
Mm.
palaces dripping with imported marble, gilded ceilings.
The sums spent on just one thing could be staggering. Thousands for a skilled cook or a pair of fancy silver cups.
It's worth remembering, though, this kind of extravagance wasn't new, right? People had been complaining about it for centuries.
True. But it seems to reach a kind of fever pitch in this era.
Now, something else that really jumps out from the sources is the changing role of women, this idea of the new woman.
Ah, yes. And figures like the satirist Juvenal clearly hated this shift. He portrays women very negatively, sometimes viciously.
But the sources push back on that a bit.
They do. They point out that the emancipation of women, giving them more freedom and influence, had actually started much earlier, centuries before this period, really.
So Juvenal's view isn't the whole story.
Not at all. The sources note women achieving higher levels of culture, gaining more influence in public affairs. Juvenal's critique is contrasted with these high ideals of womanhood you find in contemporaries like Plutarch or Musonius.
Musonius even argued for equal moral standards for men and women.
Exactly. Equal continence, he called for, which was pretty radical for the time.
So you have this fascinating contradiction. Some sources praising virtuous women, others condemning what they saw as, I don't know, moral decline.
And the material gives examples of incredibly virtuous women, too, like the elder and younger Arria, Fania, Pliny's own wife Calpurnia, real models of traditional virtue.
So the reality was much more complex than just the satirist's attacks.
Definitely. But the sources also acknowledge there were real concerns about promiscuity affecting family stability. There's even mention of a decree from Vespasian's time trying to address the general license.
So it was clearly an era of significant social change and debate around women's roles.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if we had to pull out one key insight about the Roman elite in this period, what would it be?
I'd say the core thing is this tension. They navigated a world of incredible personal wealth and luxury,
Right.
while at the same time their traditional political power was often declining, and they faced extreme political instability depending on who was emperor.
That must have created huge pressure.
Exactly. Deep internal tensions. And it led to really different responses. Philosophical withdrawal, sharp critique like Tacitus, massive displays of wealth, or just the quiet pursuit of civic duty and personal virtue like Pliny.
A study in contradictions, really.
Perfectly put.
Okay, so stepping away from that world of old money and established power, the sources introduce a completely different group gaining prominence. The freedmen.
Ah, yes. People who had been enslaved but managed to gain their freedom.
And the attitude towards them was mixed.
Very mixed. Some sources clearly show contempt, look down on them, but others saw their rise as genuinely a hopeful sign, social mobility, opportunity in the empire.
What helped them rise?
A big factor was deliberate imperial policy. Emperors, and this really got solidified under Hadrian, started employing freedmen and later men of the equestrian rank, the sort of business class in the growing imperial bureaucracy.
So they weren't just free, they were getting actual power,
Mm.
political, economic power.
Absolutely. You had these incredibly powerful freedmen. The sources name figures like Polybius, Claudius Etruscus, Abascantus. They wielded immense influence, made huge fortunes.
And sometimes got a bit arrogant with it.
According to some sources, definitely. Pallas, under the Emperor Claudius, is often cited as an example of freedman insolence.
And how did they make all this money? Was it just government jobs?
Primarily through trade, industry, speculation. They were involved in the real economy, and they weren't afraid to show off their wealth.
That's where the stereotype comes from.
Pretty much. Their wealth was often linked to, well, vulgar ostentation, over-the-top baths, gardens, houses. Freedman's wealth became a kind of proverb for showy, maybe slightly tacky extravagance.
Like Trimalchio's dinner and Petronius's Satyricon. That's the classic example, right?
The ultimate caricature, yes. But the Satyricon, even though it's satire, gives us this vivid, if exaggerated, glimpse into their world.
What does it show?
Well, Trimalchio's own story, rising from slavery to enormous wealth, is key. And the famous dinner scene perfectly highlights his aspirations to seem cultured and learned.
But it clashes with the reality.
Totally. It contrasts sharply with the sheer vulgarity and lack of real refinement among his guests. The sources also mention these dissolute Greek adventurers hanging around, adding another layer to that social scene.
Okay, so they have money, they have influence in some areas, but Were they actually accepted by the old aristocracy? Did they make it into the upper crust?
Not really, no. The sources are pretty clear they were seldom admitted to equal rank. The Senate might flatter them if they needed something, but often held them in contempt behind their backs.
And freed women, women who'd been slaves.
Their position was also often uncertain, kind of ambiguous, so yeah, there were definite social barriers that even massive wealth couldn't entirely break down.
What about their relationship with their former owners, the patrons? Was that connection still important?
Hugely important. It was a really significant tie. The patron often provided ongoing support, protection.
And the freedmen.
In return, freedmen often gave their patrons a crucial start in trade or business, using their own skills and connections. There was even an obligation for patrons to keep supporting their emancipated slaves. It wasn't always a clean break.
So a trusted slave could potentially earn their freedom through that relationship over time.
Exactly. And finally, the source material mentions the Augustales. What were they?
Ah, yes. They were really important, especially in the provincial towns, the municipalities outside Rome.
An organization. An order, really, largely made up of wealthy freedmen. They gained significant social standing and local influence by funding public works, building baths, temples, that sort of thing, and by participating in the imperial cult.
Worshipping the emperors.
Essentially, yes.
Yep.
Becoming priests of the deified emperors. It was a clear pathway for freedmen to get visibility, respect within their local communities, even if the old Roman aristocracy still looked down on them from afar.
So the key insight on the freedmen, then.
I think their rise really shows the dynamic social mobility that was possible in the Roman world. They used economic power, imperial service, to gain incredible wealth and influence, genuinely challenging the old order.
Wow.
But their story also reveals the persistent reality of social stratification. They climbed incredibly high, but rarely, if ever, achieved true acceptance or full integration into those highest aristocratic circles. They symbolize both opportunity and enduring class division.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus now from these specific groups to the broader picture. City life. The sources really stress the huge scale and development of urban life in this period.
The Roman Empire truly was a realm of cities, wasn't it? It wasn't just the ancient famous ones. New cities were popping up everywhere, often growing out of legionary camps on the frontiers.
Spreading Roman culture and administration as they went.
Exactly. And there was this general trend towards a degree of uniformity, how these towns were governed, the kinds of freedoms they had across the empire.
And the sources suggest people felt a really strong connection to their local town. Intense local pride.
Oh, absolutely. For many people, their own town, their municipality, became their patria, their true homeland, even within this giant empire.
You can almost feel it in the inscriptions and things.
Yes, a genuine, deep public spirit, love for their local commonwealth. And this was visibly expressed through public benefactions, gift-giving on a grand scale.
This was expected of the wealthy.
It really was, seen as a clear duty. For the traditional elite and for those wealthy freedmen we just talked about, contributing generously to their towns was crucial for status.
The source material has some great examples.
It does, like Hulconius Rufus funding the theater at Pompeii, or a citizen paying for an entire aqueduct for Bordeaux, imagine that, or Krinos building city walls.
And women got involved too.
Yes, women also made significant public benefactions, but it wasn't all glory. This level of generosity, while it boosted your status, could put a serious strain on your finances. It could even lead to ruin.
So, alongside this civic duty, there was also this huge passion for amusement. Entertainment.
Enormous, and often described as quite, debasing.
How much entertainment are we talking?
Well, the sources mention games and spectacles filling the calendar, up to 135 days a year in some places.
Wow. That's a lot of holidays.
It is, and the passion for gladiatorial shows was particularly intense, especially in regions like Campania, Pompeii. You know, we have the gladiators' barracks preserved, advertisements painted on walls. It shows how deeply ingrained it was.
Was it like that everywhere?
Less so in Greece, interestingly.
Oh.
They weren't quite as keen on the blood sports, and philosophers generally strongly disapproved of the brutality.
Okay, what about the colleges and guilds? They sound like they were really fundamental to everyday life in the cities.
Absolutely vital. These were all sorts of associations covering different groups. You had plebeian colleges for common workers, military ones for veterans, and especially funerary colleges.
Funerary colleges for burials.
Exactly. Ensuring a proper burial was hugely important to Romans. These colleges guaranteed that for their members. Initially, the authorities were a bit suspicious of these groups, worried about unrest.
But they couldn't stop them.
No, the movement was irresistible. Their purposes were just too crucial. Proper burial, like I said, but also mutual help, social connection, a sense of shared identity based on your job, miners, bakers, boatmen, whatever it was.
Do they have, like, clubhouses and officers?
They did. They were often quite formally structured. They had patrons, usually wealthy individuals, elected officers, even different ranks within the college. They had their own meeting places called scholae, often with altars or chapels.
And getting patrons was important.
Very. Securing wealthy patrons, receiving donations or bequests to fund those all-important funerary rites for members, that was key to their survival.
Now, it's mentioned that within these colleges, sometimes a slave could be treated as an equal, temporarily.
Yes, that's an interesting point. Within the specific context of the college's activities, maybe a shared meal or a religious rite, some of the usual social barriers could be lowered for a time. But it's important not to overstate it. Outside the college meeting, those rank differences absolutely still persisted.
Okay. The sources also mention a benevolent spirit existing alongside all this focus on wealth and status. How did that show itself?
Well, there were actual charitable foundations. Some established by emperors Nero, Marcus Aurelius, are mentioned specifically to help orphans and the needy. There was also imperial aid when disaster struck.
And private charity?
Yes, Pliny is again the prime example here. His letters detail impressive gifts not just to his peers, but also to his dependents, including his slaves.
But the picture isn't entirely positive about how Romans viewed the less fortunate, is it?
No, definitely not. The sources, particularly the satirist Juvenal, show a real contempt for poverty, especially in his time. Being poor wasn't just unfortunate, it could block any chance of merit getting recognized and make you an object of ridicule.
So despite the charity, there was still a harshness.
Yes. Municipal life, for all the moments of social sympathy you might find during communal feasts, often seemed to prioritize material enjoyment, splendor, outward show. And those spectacles, while they brought people together in shared passion, could also be deeply debasing, normalizing violence.
So wrapping up city life, what's the key takeaway?
I think it's the vibrancy combined with the contradictions. Roman cities were these dynamic centers fueled by strong local identity and civic pride, shown through the generosity of the wealthy. But that was balanced by this pervasive love for often brutal entertainment, clear social stratification marked by a real contempt for poverty, and crucially, these associations, the colleges, acting as vital social safety nets, providing identity, community, a sense of belonging in these potentially overwhelming urban environments.
Okay, let's move from the physical world, the cities and social structures, to the inner lives of people, their beliefs, their search for meaning. The sources suggest this was a really important dimension of the age.
Yes, very much so. Especially as you move towards that Antonine period, you can detect this clear movement towards a deeper spiritual vision, a craving for a moral God, for divine help.
Why then? Was life feeling more uncertain?
Life could always be precarious in the ancient world, but perhaps there was a growing sense, despite the surface prosperity for some, that something more was needed. People were clearly searching.
And philosophy shifted to try and meet that need.
It seems so. Philosophy became less about abstract, detached speculation and more focused on practical moral guidance. The ars vivendi, the art of living. People wanted tools to navigate life's challenges.
And they weren't strict about sticking to one school of thought.
No, there was a definite tendency toward eclecticism, a kind of blending of ideas, taking useful bits from Stoicism, Platonism, Cynicism, even Epicureanism, whatever seemed helpful.
Stoicism seems to come up a lot, though.
It was hugely influential. Seneca is a key voice again, wrestling with that tedium vitae, that weariness, but also preaching empathy, condemning revenge, vividly describing the torments of a guilty conscience.
What was the Stoic goal?
The ideal was the sapiens, the perfectly wise person, achieving a kind of moral perfection and inner tranquility. But they also realistically acknowledged that moral progress was a journey with different stages.
And their idea of God changed.
It evolved, yes, from maybe a more abstract, materialistic force within the universe to something closer to a personal, moral, almost fatherly figure for some Stoic thinkers.
Okay, what about Platonism? Who represents that?
Thinkers like Plutarch are key figures here. He explored really complex ideas about God. He also used demonology, this belief in intermediate spirits or divine forces between the gods and humans.
To do what?
To kind of reinterpret and make sense of the old traditional myths, which some educated people were starting to question. He also wrote fascinating accounts about the soul's journey after death, like the vision of Timarchus.
And this idea of a personal demon.
Yeah, that could be understood almost like a higher self or a personal guardian spirit watching over you.
Then you had the cynics. They sound like the rebels.
They absolutely were. The philosophical counterculture. They saw themselves as preachers, actively challenging the materialism and conventions of the age. Their big message was renunciation, simplifying your life radically.
How did they see their role?
Epictetus, another famous Stoic with cynic leanings, described the true cynic as a messenger sent from Zeus, basically to tell society it was doing things wrong.
Did they get in trouble for that?
Sometimes, figures like Demetrius apparently weren't afraid to challenge emperors directly, but others, like Demonax, actually achieved surprising popularity, despite the school often having a reputation for being coarse or arrogant.
And the Epicureans, often misunderstood, right?
Yes, frequently attacked or misrepresented as just pleasure seekers. Though Seneca, interestingly, defended Epicurus himself against those vulgar interpretations.
What was their actual focus?
They sought tranquility, ataraxia, peace of mind, mainly by living simply, managing desires and avoiding pain, both physical and mental. They famously resisted religious charlatans like Alexander of Aponotechos.
Their view on death.
For them, death was simply dissolution, the end. No consciousness, no afterlife torments to worry about, which in a way was meant to be liberating.
Okay, so that's philosophy. But beyond that, the sources point to this huge influx of new religions, especially from the East.
A massive development, driven by Roman conquest, trade, the movement of soldiers and people across the empire. And it led to this phenomenon called syncretism,
Meaning?
basically identifying Roman and Greek gods with Eastern deities, seeing them as different aspects of the same divine power. Jupiter might be identified with an Eastern sky god, Venus with Astarte, and so on.
And did this lead towards monotheism for some?
Among more educated or philosophically inclined individuals, yes. It often expressed a kind of drift towards focusing devotion on a single, supreme, divine figure. Sometimes this found expression in the worship of Isis or the sun god Sol Invictus.
The cult of Isis seems to have been incredibly popular.
Hugely popular. It spread remarkably far. Part of its appeal was the mysticism, the elaborate ceremonies, the sheer pomp. It held a particular fascination for women, apparently.
How did it spread?
Through all sorts of channels, slaves, soldiers, government officials, traders carried it with them. We find evidence of Isis worship as far away as Roman York in Britain.
Wow, and it offered something tangible.
Yes, the rituals, which we know a bit about from sources like Apuleius' novel The Golden Ass and the sacred guilds, the Isiaci, provided a strong sense of community. And crucially, it offered its followers a powerful hope of immortality, a positive afterlife.
And Mithraism, what was that about?
Mithraism had ancient Persian origins. Mithras was seen as a god of light, truth, justice, the one who upheld contracts. It spread widely, especially through the army and also among the slave class.
Why the army?
It was a religion that emphasized struggle, discipline, loyalty, and hierarchy values that resonated with soldiers. It involved 7 grades of initiation, with symbolic ceremonies often held in underground cave-like chapels called Mithraea.
What role did Mithras play for his followers?
He was seen as a mediator between humanity and the supreme god, a powerful champion fighting against evil forces, and ultimately a giver of victory, including victory over death.
So another promise of an afterlife.
Yes. It was often identified with the sun god, too, and tended to support imperial power. It appealed strongly as a religion of strenuous effort, like being a soldier for Mithras, with the hope of reward in the next life.
The source also mentions Magna Mater, the great mother goddess, and a controversial rite.
Yes, the cult of Magna Mater was also elevated during this period. It's particularly associated with the Toribolium,
What was that?
a ritual involving the sacrifice of a bull, where the initiate might be drenched in its blood. It was seen as a powerful act of purification, maybe even spiritual rebirth.
And controversial.
Extremely, especially to early Christian writers who saw it as a shocking, even demonic parody of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary.
So alongside these more organized religions and philosophies, did older beliefs, maybe superstitions, still hold sway?
Oh, absolutely. Belief in genie personal guardian spirits, dreams, omens, oracles was pervasive. It wasn't just the uneducated masses either. Yes, old oracles like the one at Delphi saw revivals. New ones popped up, some clearly fraudulent, like that of Alexander of Abonotechos we mentioned. He was a total imposter, but ran a very successful business-like operation, gaining huge fame.
Despite being exposed.
Despite being exposed, particularly by the Epicureans, belief in healing through visions in temples dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine, was also very common.
Even respected historians recorded unusual events.
Even learned historians like Tacitus and Suetonius calmly recorded miracles, portents, omens as if they were historical facts. Astrology was huge. Dream interpretation on neuromancy was a serious practice, with handbooks like the one by Artemidorus.
So diviners and fortune tellers had real influence.
Real influence, even on emperors like Tiberius, Nero, Otho. So while, yes, educated skepticism existed, Lucian, the satirist, mocked these beliefs relentlessly, as did some philosophers. Popular belief in these kinds of supernatural forces remained incredibly strong and widespread.
Finally, the sources talk about Roman feelings about death and the afterlife.
Yes, there was clearly a deep-seated sense of family piety and a very strong desire to avoid being neglected or forgotten after death.
That's where the funerary colleges came in again.
Exactly. They were essential for ensuring the proper rites were performed, that your memory was honored. You see the evidence physically, too. The tombs lining the roads leading out of cities, like the Via Appia near Rome or the road from Pompeii towards Nola.
And the inscriptions on them.
Often quite moving. Prayers for the peace of the departed, but also sometimes fierce curses on anyone who might dare to disturb the grave.
Did they believe the dead were still around somehow?
Often, yes. The dead were frequently thought of as kindly spirits, manes, watching over their living family members, though there's also mention of belief in potentially harmful or angry spirits, perhaps connected to violent death, like in the arena, who needed to be appeased maybe with blood offerings.
And ideas about actual immortality, what happened after death.
Very varied, often quite confused, actually, as you even see reflected in a sophisticated writer like Virgil. Different philosophical schools offered different possibilities.
Like what?
Stoicism suggested a limited immortality for the soul, maybe rejoining the universal fire eventually, though some Stoics, like Panaetius, rejected even that. Aristotelians talked about the permanence of abstract reason, not necessarily personal survival. Platonists had elaborate ideas about the soul's journey after death.
So lots of different views competing.
Exactly. Educated doubts certainly existed. But popular faith, perhaps fueled by the emotional appeal and concrete promises of those new Eastern cults like Isis and Mithra, seems potentially to have been stronger among the wider population. Overall, you sense this deep, widespread longing for some kind of infinite future, some escape from finality, even alongside a very clear awareness of mortality.
So if we zoom out on the spiritual landscape, what's the core insight?
I think it's that the Antonine Age, and the period leading into it, was marked by this profound spiritual hunger. In a world that could feel very materialistic, politically uncertain, people were actively searching.
Searching for what?
Meaning divine help, reassurance, hope for an afterlife. And they sought it through this incredibly diverse, often overlapping and syncretistic mix of philosophical inquiry, traditional Roman religious practices, and these compelling new Eastern religions. It was just an era of intense spiritual searching and experimentation.
So as we bring this deep dive towards a close, it's just so clear, isn't it? The period from Nero through the Antonine Age wasn't one simple thing.
Not at all. And our source material, because it comes through these very different lenses, Juvenal the angry satirist, Tacitus the moralistic historian, Pliny the idealistic letter writer, Petronius the sharp social observer, Plutarch the philosopher, Seneca grappling with it all.
It gives us these varied, sometimes clashing perspectives.
And that's precisely what makes it so rich, so fascinating. These different viewpoints, colored by who the authors were, their class, their ideals, their purpose, it just underscores the sheer complexity of the age.
There wasn't just one Roman experience.
Absolutely not.
Exactly. We've seen this Roman world wrestling with just incredible wealth right alongside stark poverty, navigating really rapid social change with the rise of the freedmen, enduring political instability that swung wildly from terror to relatively humane rule.
And underneath all of that, this deep, persistent human need for spiritual connection, for meaning.
The details we get from these ancient sources, they offer these amazing glimpses into how people actually lived. Not just the famous emperors, but the daily struggles, the hopes.
Seeking security and community, maybe through those colleges. Finding solace in philosophy or in the promises of the new religions, just trying to get by, whether aiming for virtue or simply survival.
This deep dive, it really reveals a society that maybe in its fundamental human struggles, it feels surprisingly relevant.
Has-
Well, that tension between holding on to tradition and embracing change, the basic search for connection, for belonging, the powerful draw of wealth and status, and that enduring quest for meaning when faced with life's challenges, and ultimately, the mystery of death.
It does resonate, doesn't it? Perhaps not so fundamentally different from the world we grapple with today.
So what stands out to you, listening to this journey into the Antonine world? How do the hopes, the fears, the daily lives of people from nearly 2,000 years ago connect with the world you inhabit right now?
It really makes you think, doesn't it?